evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to this very special event. I should start by saying Happy International Women's Day, even though that's not till the end of the week. We're managing to turn International Women's Day into International Women's Week, into International Women's Month, and so it goes on. I'm delighted to be here in my capacity as the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Of course, I was in the past Australian Prime Minister, so hello to any Aussies on the audience. We always manage to attract a disproportionate number of Australians to these events. Tonight's event is coming to you through Ipsos MORI in collaboration with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership and International Women's Day. And the purpose of this evening is to present to you global research about gender perceptions, which I think you will enjoy looking at, and then to have a conversation about it. Now, I'm neglecting my slides, that's me. But more importantly, and I will introduce them individually later on, we've got a high-powered panel to discuss the findings that Ipsos MORI is going to present tonight. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to invite Kelly from Ipsos MORI to join me on stage, and she will present the research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia, and thanks to everybody for coming out tonight. I'm delighted to be here and for our team to have had the opportunity to work with Julia's team at the Global Institute, as well as the team at International Women's Day, to conduct the important work looking at global attitudes to gender equality, because understanding the attitudes will help us to understand how to change behaviours and ultimately take action in order to improve gender equality globally. So first, to tell you a little bit about our study. So this is the second year we've conducted this research, and we spoke to 18,000 people globally online, and we spoke to them across 27 countries. So that's quite a large study. We talked to them about all sorts of issues last year and this year. Last year, we predominantly focused on what are the key issues you think are facing women in your country, and a little bit about what progress do you think we're making around gender equality. And this year we took it further, and we asked them about what are the key issues that you think will help women in your country achieve balance for better. So I thought I would start by telling you a little bit about some of the good news from the findings, or relative good news. So who cares about gender equality globally? Thankfully, quite a lot of people actually, almost 2/3 of the people we spoke to said that gender equality and achieving it is personally important to them. And when you look at the variations by country, you can see some of the South American countries like Chile, Peru, Colombia, and also Spain. You can see that they are believing that it is more important to them that we personally achieve gender equality. And down the bottom, you have some countries lagging, such as Russia and Japan, which may not be a surprise. And then in the middle, you have the UK, with around 3 in 5 people saying that it's personally important to them. But what's more interesting, actually, is when we look at some of the countries where the difference in attitudes between men and women is quite different. So globally, on average, there's a 7% difference where women are more likely to tell us that it's personally important to them that we achieve gender equality than men. But when you look at some of the countries like Australia, Julia, Sweden, Great Britain, and South Korea, you can see that the gap in perceptions is quite different. And what kind of things might be driving this? Possibly people's perceptions of progress to date, but also their expectations about what reaching gender equality actually will look like. So that's my first piece of relative good news. And to tell you my second, I need to give you a bit of context. So, please meet Dave. So, Dave is a perfectly nice man, and I will caveat everything I say with that. Dave is the Chief Executive Officer of Morrison's. He is one of many Daves, actually. I could have picked on more than just this Dave. There are another 6 people called Dave who lead FTSE 100 companies in the UK today. There are also 7 called Steve. And there are 6 women leading FTSE 100 companies in the UK today. So you're more likely to lead a FTSE 100 company if you're called Steve or if you're called Dave than you are if you're a female. It's a depressing stat, but this is good news. So actually 3/4 of the people we spoke to told us that they would feel comfortable having a female boss. So even though change at that very top level in business has not changed dramatically yet, we are seeing shifts in attitudes at the level below. So 3/4 of people said they'd be comfortable. Again, we have some countries lagging behind: India, South Korea, Malaysia, and we still have 1 in 5 men who say that they would feel uncomfortable with a female boss. Now, there's trend data on this that runs back over many decades in the US, where they've been tracking people's perceptions towards the gender of their boss. And for the first time in 2017, instead of being a man, which has been trending down over time, it was gender agnostic, actually. People didn't mind what gender their boss was. So we are seeing progress in that particular area. And then my third and possibly final and most favourite piece of good news is that Piers Morgan is wrong. So, thank you, Rosie. I know. So I'm saying this, but he's tweeting against us at the minute about this very quote. But Piers Morgan, you might remember at the back end of last year, something called Papoosegate, where he tweeted a picture of Daniel Craig carrying his baby in a papoose baby carrier with the hashtag emasculated bond. Now, whilst he wasn't directly saying what I'm about to say, the same sense was there. And actually, he's wrong, because traditional gender roles are beginning to no longer apply. 3/4 of the people that we spoke to disagreed that if a man stays at home to look after his children, he is less of a man. And that's a really good piece of information. Beyond that, again, there's been some long-term research conducted here in the UK, actually, from the British Social Attitudes Study, which has looked at whether or not the man is perceived as the breadwinner and the woman as the homemaker. And in 1990, that was around 50%. Today, it's closer to 1 in 10, stating that that's the case. So it's still at 1 in 10, but we have made significant progress over time. So clearly, progress has been made, but what else is there left to do? And similarly to last year, we asked people what they thought were the key issues facing women in their society, in their country today. And depressingly, some of the same answers came back as they did in 2018. Predominantly linked to women's safety and equal pay. The top 3 issues globally facing women today globally are sexual harassment, sexual violence, and physical violence. Those are the top 3 globally, and it varies by country. And if we pick out some of those issues and have a look at them in more detail. So sexual harassment, top issue flagged for people in the US, possibly linked to the fact that Me Too campaigning has been quite high profile there, but also in countries such as Turkey, France, Argentina, Mexico, and Malaysia. In most of the European countries we surveyed, equal pay came out top, and I can still include the UK in there for another 24 days, and possibly longer, we shall see, and Canada. And then 2 in 5 people in Australia came back and told us that it was domestic violence is the key issue facing women in their society today, as well as in Serbia, this ranked top as well. So clearly, still an awful lot to do. And what do we think is going to happen tomorrow? Well, actually, we expect the gender gap to persist for quite some time. We asked people about the next 20 years and whether they thought that things would improve around gender discrimination and actually end within the next 20 years. So it's not a huge surprise to see that across none of these spheres, people thought that we would still have gender discrimination. But if you look at some of them, so in education, we are more confident that we will see an end. And in the area of government and politics, which is probably one of our most influential spheres, we are least confident. And this corresponds with some of the data from the most recent report from the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report, where they also state it's going to take 202 years to achieve gender equality, and it's stagnating. The improvement in gender equality and women's political empowerment, that has stagnated in recent years. So that's the sort of current and also the future. But it's really surprising then when we look at people's views of progress. And you can see here that opinions are really divided on whether the push for equality has gone far enough. In fact, globally, 2 in 5 people think it's gone far enough already. I know. But hold your breath, because even more worryingly, it's almost half of the men we spoke to believe things have gone far enough, compared to 1/3 of women. So what can we do to make a change and a positive change? Now, clearly there's been a lot of activity in this area around women's empowerment, gender equality over the decades that have passed. In some of the developing communities, we'll have seen things like better access to healthcare, girls' education, and in the developed context, we see now gender pay gap reporting, we see unconscious bias training in the workplace, and we see shared parental leave. When we ask people what they think will make the big difference, they tell us these things. So firstly, huge roles for the state and employer. For the employers, pay women the same you pay men to do the same role. A third of people, over a third, tell us that. For the state, it's about tougher laws around sexual violence and harassment, but it's also about teaching young people about the importance of gender equality and why it's important to make a change. Those are the top three things that come out. But beyond what the state and the employer can do, what comes out universally clear, so 2/3 of people tell us this, without men taking action to improve gender equality, women and men will not achieve it. And even the men agree on that one, 61% for the men reporting back there, just so you know. But this isn't going to be without its challenges, because globally, we find that 50% of men tell us that they think they're already doing too much in support of gender equality. So I can't tell you whether this is a good statistic or a bad statistic, because we haven't actually tracked it over time, and I can't find anybody else that has. And we do need to monitor whether or not we're seeing this sort of gender equality fatigue happening. But 50%, it just sounds very big to me. So if I leave you with 3 messages, we have made progress over decades, but also you can see real attitudinal shifts around both how important equality is for people and also traditional roles at home and at work. There's action required for both the state and from employers, but most importantly men, and that's not just in the influential roles they hold in society, at the top of boards, in FTSE 100 companies, and in political roles. It's at the level of every home and every workplace, where there's those relationships and that implicit social contract between a man and a woman. And thirdly, we need to demonstrate and not just talk about the importance of gender equality, and the benefits of it for all. Otherwise, we're really going to struggle to achieve balance for better. Thank you. I'll take control.
Oh, sorry.
I think you should be on the end, well, should you?
Hi.
Well, we promised you a high-powered panel to discuss the findings, and here it is. So I am going to put a question to each of my guests, and I'm going to introduce them as I do so. So first I'm going to start with Pamela Hutchinson, who's the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion for Bloomberg. Now, Pamela and I met the other day and had a discussion about these findings and a discussion about the fact that she's been involved in diversity and inclusion for around 20 years now. And she said to me that a few years into her career, when she was about the 5-year mark, she was thinking to herself, well, when all of this is fixed, I'm going to have to get a different job. I might have to go back to being a lawyer, starting to make plans for that career transition. But 20 years on, we've still got much to do. Pamela, why haven't we made more progress?
Well, indeed. It's kind of scary when you read that 202 years for women to get parity with men. I'll be long gone dead, as will most of you, well, all of you in this room. And that's actually really depressing when you think about that. You know, the saying, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. That is true for the gender agenda, in my view. We have tried so hard we've introduced things like women's programs, mentoring, sponsorship. These things are not moving the needle. They're great things, don't get me wrong, they are great things for organisations to be doing. but it's not moving the needle. And I think it's because organisations, frankly, haven't been intentional about this. Where organisations have been intentional about the business happens. They don't view diversity, gender diversity, ethnicity, whatever the topic is, in the same way. Where I've seen organisations really make progress, that's where the senior leader, the CEO, the chairman, the organisation has said, this is important to us, as important as business, and we are going to create change in our organisations. So I do think, you know, it's something about organisations being very intentional, very clear about what they want to do on gender diversity. I was, you know, at Bloomberg, we celebrate International Women's Day for an entire month. So I'm spending the entire month travelling the world, talking, meeting with people. And as I talked about the fact that, you know, it's going to take 202 years to create gender parity, I did say, but we can do better, right? Organisations can do better if they want to. And, you know, there's the whole piece also about, you know, the business case. You know, the business case has been around for a very long time, but it is not persuasive. If it was really persuasive, organisations would do a lot different, it would look a lot different now. I'm not sure that the business case influences people to create change in their organisations. It's not context specific enough. You need to create what the business case is for your particular business, where you've got examples. And organisations really aren't doing that. I think that's another important piece. It takes more than just the business case to move this agenda. It takes a lot more. And actually, there's nothing wrong with doing the right thing. And organisations need to also embrace that. And finally, I would say the whole gender sort of fatigue piece. Again, I'm not surprised. We're just not making progress. So if you don't make progress, you get bored very quickly. In addition to that, I do think that, you know, for the poor male manager in organisations who get beaten up quite a lot on this agenda, you know, I'm not surprised that they get frustrated or that the stats say what they do. If you're a man in an organisation and organisations are just focused on women, let's get more women to the top, let's train women, let's develop women, I can understand why they don't want to get engaged with this. So there is something about how do we encourage men to be part of the solution? And not sort of as kind of like we go to them afterwards with, oh, these are some of the things we want to do. But actually, one of the things that we're doing at Bloomberg is we've introduced something called the Inclusion Dialogues. And the Inclusion Dialogues are saying, okay, if you're not happy with the way that we're creating change, what would you do? What would you suggest? If you were a woman, how would you like us to go around doing this? So I do think there's something about including men in the dialogue in order to move this agenda forward. One last point, if I may. Sorry, you can tell I'm on my soapbox now. The other thing that I think I've started to see happening rise a lot as there's been a lot of gender fatigue is that we're starting to see a lot more movement amongst other women, different women, diverse women, who have felt that the gender agenda has not been about them. And I'm talking about disabled women, LGBT women, ethnic minority women. Whilst we've really pushed this agenda, we have not seen progress for those women. So where is the sisterhood in all of this?
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. Pamela talked about including men in the dialogue, so I'm going to include a man in the dialogue. We're joined by Will McDonald, who's the Public Policy Director of Beaver. He could be talking to us at length about his work on Brexit, but we are talking about some other topic tonight, thankfully.
Yeah.
Will, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is, of course, a heavily evidence-based research institute. We've researched long and hard, and we have only found you as a man in a male job share at work. You share your job with another man, both doing 3 days a week, which makes you simultaneously the most senior job sharing man in the UK and the lowest job sharing man in the UK. Can you talk to us about that work structure, how it came about, and what you think the role modelling impact of it is in your business?
Yeah, sure. So it's hi, thanks for having me. It's really good to be here. It's utterly fantastic what I have been fortunate enough to work towards. And it's been quite a long journey. I think me and my wife set out about 10 years ago to get to 3 days a week each, and it took us about 8 years, and it took us a fantastic employer. Those are probably the key things. So, I mean, I would hope everyone knows roughly, can guess what a job share is. We both work 3 days a week. I work the second half of the week. We overlap on Wednesdays, but we don't duplicate. We rely very heavily on handover notes. So it's one of our principles, is it's seamless from the outside. So we run sort of 3 teams across the world. So we run sustainability, government relations, and corporate responsibility. And a lot of that is external. So if ever we come into contact with you, it should make no difference who you contact. The other will know what's happened, and that is we make that our job to make it seamless. So I think, I guess where to start, what we started to do when we were looking at how we'd pitch this internally was we went around and spoke to quite a lot of people who'd done job shares. And what was really interesting is they had lots of useful things about how to pitch it. So pitch it as a trial, make sure you get some principles between you, make sure that you're seen as taking this very seriously, that you're not leaving your ambition behind, etc. But what was absolutely amazing was that they were all evangelical about job shares. They were, even the ones who weren't on job shares were dying to get back into job shares. They loved this. And I think they were all women, obviously, although there are a couple of mixed job shares out there. But I think what I've worked out, so we're nearly 2 years of job sharing, me and Sam, my work marriage, my work husband. I don't know what it is. It's about the kind of loyalty and the dynamic between you. So I have a huge loyalty to the company and my job, my career, but also Sam. Like if I've only got 3 days to get a lot of work done and then I hand it over to him, I want him to walk in on Monday having seen that I've done great stuff with our job and he can do it. And you just don't get that. I've worked 4 days a week in the past, and it's kind of the reverse. You're kind of disloyal to yourself because you're overworking the whole time. So the dynamic is very different. And I think what's beautiful about the week, and this is very different from working part-time, is that when I'm in work, I'm fully in work. I've only got 3 days to get up to speed and get on with it. And when I'm not in work, almost any email I send will disrupt Sam. Right. It will actively annoy him. So the dynamic is very much, I need to get off my email. So I am not on email 2 days a week. And I'm not casually checking it. So when I'm with my kids, or now that my kids are all at school, I'm going mountain biking. That only started 2 weeks ago, so I'm still pretty excited about that. But I think this is really interesting that what and I think we hoped it would end up this, but it has been an amazing experience. And I think that's the work side, obviously, and the home side is obviously for 2 days a week. I get to care for my 3 kids who are 6, 5, and 3. They are now just all in some kind of educational setting, but they haven't been, and I have spent so much time with my youngest in the last couple of years, and we have a completely different relationship. It's totally transformed our weekends because my wife and I are equal, and the test, I've never come up with a better test. You say to your kids, who do you want to get you out of the bath? And for the first, 4 years of having children, it was mummy, 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 and now it's about equal. So that is, it's brilliant.
Fantastic, thank you. And has it inspired others in the business to think about the same arrangement?
A few.
A few,
yeah. I think what we get a lot is, we get 2 things. One is, that's wonderful, but it wouldn't work in my job. So we report into CEO level at a global company. We have it's pretty much an external job. So all the things that people say, I mean, I guess if you were an airline pilot and you would have to switch pilots mid-air, I guess that would be tricky. But other than that, I really don't think there is a job that you can't job share. The other argument you get is a kind of real men don't job share, which is great because, I mean, it's bollocks. I mean, it's just rubbish.
Yes.
And I think
shown by the research that's not people's perceptions in terms of caring for kids.
Yeah. So. I think where I've got to come back to what Pamela was saying is I've got if I'm looking for optimism about change, I would say despite employers and governments, that actually individuals, couples, families are getting on with it. If you go, so I go around the country in Aviva and I meet, say, a room of 40 dads who are working in Aviva. Almost all of those who have kids are doing some kind of flexible arrangement. It won't show up on our systems, it doesn't show up in their pay, in their hours, but their line manager and them have got a deal that Wednesdays and Thursdays they drop off and pick up at school or something. And if you look at school gates, dads are there, and grandparents, the granddads are there as well. So my optimistic take is that things are changing. Dads are getting more involved. That is better for the couple, it's better for the family, it's much better for the mother, and that will take a very long time to work its way through to the big macro stats. But it's the only bit of optimism I can cling to.
Okay, good. We like optimism. I'm going to turn now to Dame Helena Morrissey. Helena has had a stellar corporate career, including being CEO of Newton for 15 years. She's now responsible for the personal investing business at Legal & General. She set up the 30% Club to pursue the campaign to get more women on corporate boards, and it has enjoyed a great deal of success. There are now 30% clubs around the world making a difference. Helena, when you look at this data set, what do you see about convergence or non-convergence between what men think and what women think? And what does that tell you about how we can push for change in the future?
Thanks, Julia. Well, again, it's great to be here. And I think it was a standout for me from this very interesting study and such a large study across so many countries, that there is this perception gap between what men think of the issue, not the wonderful men like, well, obviously, but and what women think. I mean, you shared, Kelly, that 50% of men globally think that they're doing far too much already. There were a couple of stats, I don't think, I'm not sure if people got the report totally, but just to highlight them, my favourite in some ways was that 56% of women in the UK thinks it's an advantage to be a man these days, but only 41% of men think so. So the grass is always greener is our first assumption there. That things have gone far enough. We're giving women equal rights with men. Again, over a 10% gap between the 46% of men who agreed and the 37% of women who agreed. And then we've talked about the men being expected to do too much. Now, this data is not different from other data that I've seen. The Project 2840 study that was done 5 years ago by the Gender Equality Campaign of Business in the Community came up with one around gender pay gap. I mean, it's very similar data, but different criteria that we looked at. Less than half of women who were surveyed, and this was a survey about 25,000 people, were confident that men and women earned the same money for the same level jobs as each other, versus 3/4 of men. And I think this is an issue. Pamela touched rightly on the need to engage men more, and I think if we have this perception gap, first of all, we need to not sort of say, oh, they're all wrong and we're all right. They just don't understand us or anything like that. I mean, one of the success factors, definitely with the 30% Club, at least as far as it's gone, has been engaging men, not in a militant, not in an aggressive, not in a, you've got to listen to us or we'll kind of tell you what to do way, but actually trying to show that if you have better gender balance, in that case in the boardroom, then actually will probably mean a better boardroom. And it really was such an interesting experience seeing how even the naysayers, and there were very many, very hostile men at the beginning, the members of the 30% Club are chairmen, and when we started, 99 of the FTSE chairmen were men. So even more than the Steves and the Daves, you only had one woman. So we really needed them to champion this, and many, very many, were very overtly hostile. But as they saw the grassroots things happening, as Will's so wonderfully illustrated, as they saw that actually men might welcome women in the boardroom, that actually diversity of thought was really essential to being part of a sort of modern business, then they didn't just sort of come around to it, but they actually ended up being the real champions of change, which was really wonderful to see. And it taught me that actually, in fact, several said to me, actually, we wanted to join in this because you gave us a solution to a problem rather than sort of telling us off for what we were doing wrong. Now, I think I would like to sound a note of optimism as well about the other way to engage men, and that is, I think, really young men, people who are still at school, young men just starting out. I genuinely believe that there's a very different expectation and desire among young men who have grown up now with a sort of drumbeat of equality around them in a way that certainly my generation didn't have. And they expect their sisters and their female friends and their daughters and their any woman they come across to sort of be equal in lots of ways, but they also expect to have a life more like Will's, I think. I'm speaking at a boys' school tomorrow evening. This is part of their International Women's Week, and it's to the Feminist Society at an all-boys school, and there is such a thing. And I'm talking about how women's progression is actually not bad news for boys. Now, I think, because a lot of them want to have balance, I think this title of Better for Balance is the way forward to show that actually you might not want to just join the treadmill and work all hours you are given and only focus on one aspect of your life. I think Will sounds very happy. And I think that sometimes, although the gender equality discussion has rightly and understandably focused so much on women's side of the equation and creating more career opportunities for women, to make more progress, we really need to focus on what it means for men, what it means to be a successful man in a modern world, and to set a new definition of success that does mean being at the school gates, or does mean playing a full active role in family life as well as having a career. So I'm excited about that. The other thing that, just very briefly, I wanted to draw attention to was, I think, a very fascinating set of statistics around the Me Too movement that you also looked at, which I think we have to note. Because in the States, where obviously it's been such a big movement, this was men and women together, but the difference was on politics. So 37% of respondents in the States felt that the Me Too movement had a positive impact on women's opportunities and society, and 31% felt it had a negative impact. But of the positives, 64% were Democrat, 25% Republican. Of the negatives, 11% Democrat, 48% Republican. So we have many divides in our society, and I think we do need to join these together and recognise that there are different arguments that work for different groups. I think it's just something to note that we often talk very generally about these issues, of believing, despite the evidence, that one set of arguments will work for everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think there's some clear sort of themes emerging about getting very specific on the change agenda and putting the arguments in a way that are going to resonate. Kelly, coming out of the statistics, one of the things I think was optimistic. You put up the "this man is wrong" slide and referred to Papoose Gate, but there's another statistic there too, which is men want employers to do more. 3/4 globally agree that employers should make it easier for men to combine childcare with work. Yeah. So do you think, when you look at the statistics, that across the whole data set, that there is a bit of a convergence around wanting more flexibilities for work and family life for both women and men?
Yeah, absolutely, there is, Julia. There is, and when you look at that one, so I think it's 73% of people who are saying that that's the case and that they feel that they need more from their employers. And women and men both say state and employers play an important role, because if you think about some things like parental leave, where the state has the first say in the overall state-level parental leave, it's up to that employer to make that parental leave actually workable for individuals in the workplace. There's a study done by the European Commission recently which looked at uptake of things like parental leave for men, and it varied by country, and the countries which had topped up the state-level parental leave by a significant proportion and made it equal to what women were actually getting, rather than just a token, a 2-week gesture, had seen much more significant uptake. In the UK, uptake amongst those that were entitled was only 2% in 2017, despite it having been in place for years before that again. So yes, there's an appetite for it, but possibly the employer needs to boost more what the state is doing in order to make it viable for people. And then beyond that, the senior level employers creating the culture where that's acceptable for men to take that kind of parental leave and to be more involved in their children's lives, and not just as a mandate, but making other employees understand the importance of it as well, so they support that man to take that leave effectively.
And so there is this question of the entitlement and its structure, and I think you're right that the evidence shows where it's a shared entitlement, then overwhelmingly it will be the women who take it. Where it's actually a vested separate entitlement for men, that increases uptake. But also the culture around it is very important. And on that question of culture, Will, I did want to go back to you. I know that you are also involved in a fatherhood institute where you spend some time working with fathers and researching questions about fatherhood. Are there insights from that about the culture of taking leave, of caring for kids that you'd like to share with the group?
I mean, I think we focus a lot in the Fatherhood Institute. It's a charity that works through dads to kind of help everyone essentially, but dads are our kind of way in. So we run grassroots stuff like getting dads reading with their kids in schools, but also campaigning on shared parental leave and that kind of thing. And I think the evidence on parental leave is that it has to be, the default is mum. So it's so strong that if you want to change that and you want to get dad doing some soul care, which is the important bit, if you get dad doing soul care in the early years, you find that your weekends are more equal, your holidays are more equal, and then when career progression changes, when life moves and opportunities come up, you'll find that the balance between mother and father is much more equal. But you really do have to start quite early on, and that's why stuff like parental leave is so important. And I think the evidence across lots of countries, if the dad's bit isn't use it or lose it, it's pretty much irrelevant. And I personally, I would go further and say that what we have in the UK at the moment as the SPL actually is the opposite. It pits, wife against husband, or woman against man. It's who gets to use this lead, how are we going to divide it up. And there is anecdotal evidence that people who split it, reasonably evenly the first time as a couple, actually the woman is taking more of it on the second time. Because, but it's become an argument, which is like the opposite of what we want to do. So I think, but I mean, I guess where we start in the Fatherhood Institute is that there is a lot of evidence out there about the beneficial effects of getting men to up their game in terms of care and giving them the skills and the confidence to do it, which is basically about learning. It's basically about doing it. You have to just change a lot of nappies, and then, hey presto, you're really good at changing nappies. But I think there's. The good news, I guess, is there's lots you can do about it. So if in a couple where a man takes 2 weeks at the beginning of the first child, the couple are 30% less likely to divorce. So you can do little things early on that make a huge difference for a long time. And I think it was Sweden, but don't quote me on that, where they basically introduced a use it or lose it daddy leave. And what they found was that every month that the dad took leave, that the mother's earnings went up by 7%. So that's forever. So if you look at some of the big things that we are trying to grapple with, I think the balance for better kind of theme for this year's International Women's Day really strikes a chord with me, because what I spend quite a lot of doing is trying to get dads in for the benefit of women and everyone and the couple and men's health, actually. Men who are more involved drink less. They have better health outcomes. Their children are healthier. Their children are more emotionally engaged, age 7 and 16. Like the stats are really compelling. And what I don't have is the answer to how do you get that across to men? How do you talk to men? So I started off in politics, and you'll know a lot more about politics, but I can't understand. I don't know how you would Google this, but how there's no political narrative that talks to men as dads. It's either men don't identify as dads, and that's what it is, or we just don't talk about it, or I don't know what the answer is. But there is no, dads aren't a group. We don't see ourselves. There's no mum's net for dads. There are lots of little pockets of activity, but I think we need to find ways through that, and that starts at a very low level, and that starts with giving dads. You need to take away the financial, barriers, and you need to take away the cultural barriers. So Aviva, where I work in the day, thanks to Jan, who's sitting in the fourth row here, started a policy a number of years ago where men and women at Aviva are given 6 months full pay, however you had your child, whoever you are. And so in the first year, I think it was 700 people took it up, and 300 of them were men, taking an average of, I think it was about 4 months. So that is a huge step forward. There's now this cohort of people in the company who have done it, and they've faced the barriers, they've faced the prejudice from their colleagues, they've had the great bits at home, they've faced the bad bits of coming back to work and how they manage that and stuff. But for me, that is a huge step forward, and those are people who will never be able to undo the benefits of soul care and equality being baked in early.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'm going to bring Helena in for a slightly different perspective on men and women sharing the care of children. Helena, you are the mother of 9 children, and your husband has been the at-home carer.
Yeah.
And can you, I mean, obviously we're talking about all different sorts of structures, but when he first did that, there must have been a lot more prejudice than now.
Definitely.
Or has it changed?
I think it has changed a lot. I mean, this is 2 decades ago that he was a journalist, and he decided, because we were really struggling, we were expecting our 4th child, that to make it work, we were struggling as a couple, as a family, and he volunteered to go freelance. And then as we had more children, but also as he realised just how intensive family life can be, he started doing less of the journalist work. But actually, one of the problems that he faced in early years, and he'll be the first to say that he feels very comfortable in his own skin, but he absolutely hated being asked, what do you do? So we'd go to, a school gate or a dinner party or just friends chatting, or people we meet for the first time, and they would say, what do you do? And then people would be almost, embarrassed. They didn't know how to pigeonhole him or assess it. We are, societally, we kind of like frame people into different sort of buckets. And he did find that he kept reinventing, stories about what he was, and took up painting and did meditation teaching, and he would focus on that rather than saying, I'm a stay-at-home dad. I mean, he had nothing to be ashamed of because he had this huge army of very happy children, and he, this is a good way of spending your life, I think. But actually now, although he is still, for example, the only dad on the PTA, the Parent Teacher Association at our daughter's school, there are many dads at the school gate, and some of them are entrepreneurs, some are retired, it's almost like a badge of honor sometimes to be able to have the flexibility, even if you're working, full-time, to be able to go and get your child, rather than, certainly when we were starting out, it was sort of much more a badge of honor to be too busy to do any of that and to be a slave to your job. So again, I think we can look upon these as cup half full, cup half empty. I think there are a lot of things to celebrate about the progress we're making, but we do need to have, more Wills, more Richards, my husband, more visible role models that I think would give a lot of other men the confidence to probably do what they really want to do.
Pamela, Bloomberg has a lot of millennials working for it. I had the pleasure of seeing your amazing office in London. I've been in the office in New York, and it's open plan, hot and cold running drinks, and fruit and popcorn, and earnest young people running here and there doing important things. Far too complicated for me to understand, but you can tell they're doing important things. Do you get a sense, part of the narrative often goes that the upcoming generation, millennials, are going to demand more work flexibility than past generations have demanded. Do you feel that in Bloomberg? Do you think that they are demanding more flexibility? Do they want to live more like Will? Do they want to look for that? Or do they end up perhaps starting with that impulse but reflecting norms that they see around them, which might be a culture of long hours and presenteeism?
Yeah, I definitely see that. It's interesting. I have a 16-year-old son. I've got 2 boys, 16-year-old son, and I travel a lot. I'm in New York twice a month. And my son said to me the other day, Mum, why the hell are you getting on an aeroplane? You know that you can do video conferencing, which I can, obviously. And he said, there is no way when I go into the workplace that I'm going to be running around the world like you do, not least your carbon footprint, blah, 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 blah. So I do think, and he's 16 and he has no intention of working in an office. And his friends are exactly the same. I definitely see that. We don't have as many millennials as it looks like when you walk into our office. But yes,
Everybody look young to me.
And to me too. And to me, it's true. But it's very true. I do think that they have a very different attitude to the workplace than perhaps my generation. Although I would say people in my generation, as you start coming into your 50s, actually you want to slow down and work flexibly as well. And so I'm seeing it at both ends, actually. In fact, particularly as you get older and you might want to slow down, or you might have grandchildren, or you just want to work differently. I don't actually think it's just something that millennials are interested in anymore. I do think it's also happening at my end of the generation too. But, we see it with them voting with their feet, right? I've worked for many years across financial services until I came into Bloomberg. And over the years, you started seeing less and less young people applying to work for financial services. They just didn't want to commit, work sort of 14-hour days or never leave the office, which used to happen quite a lot in my day. People would sleep in the office, get up next morning and go and see a client. They just don't want to do it anymore. And so, they have a very different attitude to wealth creation. A lot more of them are deciding to be entrepreneurs. So if organisations don't really seriously look at this, we're going to have a real problem in terms of just skills and people coming through the door. But I definitely don't think it's just a thing for millennials. My husband would work flexibly in a heartbeat if he had the opportunity to. And more of his friends are saying exactly the same. But unfortunately, many company cultures don't necessarily allow for that. But it's definitely not just a millennial thing.
Kelly, is looking at the research, is there any way of comparing across age groups, or is that a research project for the future?
No, we did do a little bit of it actually. We did some of it in the UK data release, but it was showing some quite strange results, or what we thought were strange results. And normally when they're strange, you're a bit concerned. So it was telling us that men, actually, I think it was like young men were feeling that it was more likely that they would have a worse future than their father's generation. And now it's probably not a strange result given some of the things that we've heard tonight, but there is that we were seeing some signs that they were feeling more concerned perhaps than the older generations, and we would have expected to see the older generations reflecting on some of that a bit more.
So the older generation more likely to say gender equality has gone too far, or it's too much of a burden for me. Is that what you
we were
mean?
starting to see younger generations saying those kind of things as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just in the UK, mind, we haven't done this across all of the global data yet, but it is a research project for the future, cutting it by by generation as well.
Some interesting things to reflect on there. Before we go to audience questions, which we are due to do, I just want to go back through the panel and, just the absolute snapshot on your mind after doing all of this work, and I'll come back through the panel. The thing that makes you optimistic, the thing you're worried about.
Optimistic that people personally care, and very worried that we are starting to see signs of gender fatigue because we haven't yet got clarity in that the demonstration of why it's important at a tailored personal level for men, for the workplace employers. Gender fatigue coming through is possibly a concern.
I'm optimistic, I think, because the longer I do this work, the more I actually think that organisations are morphing from the business case to actually it's just the right thing to do. And I think that's happening more so in the last few years with all the various different campaigns, Black Lives Matter, Me Too. We've seen this groundswell of people who are just thinking equality is really important. So I'm optimistic that doing this because it's the right thing to do is going to win out eventually and is going to be more sustainable than the business case. Was there another question?
The thing that concerns you.
What concerns me? Oh gosh. What concerns me is that there's not enough discussion with men on the solution for this.
Okay. Will.
So I I worry that the problem with men is a much wider conversation, and I'm no expert on this, but I don't think you have to look too far for the kind of crisis in masculinity. So it's difficult, I would say, to have a conversation with someone where what's happened in a lot of people's lives is their identity has been eroded, and whether that's financial or work, and that's simply because of Britain's economy over the last 30 years. You know, you look at coalfield regeneration towns and so on. You know, this is much wider than it starts somewhere else. I think it's very difficult in that conversation to turn around to people and say, you know, you should care about gender equality, which is not what people do. But I think that's a very difficult conversation to have when there's so many things going on in the world. So I find that concerning, because it feels like there are a lot of priorities. And I do deal with Brexit a lot in my day job, so maybe I'm overly worried about, you know, things, and it's all going to be brilliant. But I mean, the optimism, I would just go back to, you know, I think it is happening. I think piece by piece, you know, family by family, couple by couple, people are getting on with it. What's sad is I feel like they're doing it despite employers and despite government. And I think if I could get, you know, every company to do one thing, it would be to do a really good independent exit interview with every man. I mean, do it with every woman as well. But, you know, why have you left? And I think you find that a lot of men, there's a bit of research around this, but a lot of men move, and they might not call it, you know, lack of flexible working or because I want to see my kids more, but it's because they want a shorter commute so they can see their kids more or something. You know, these are, I think you'd see it a lot there, but we don't have a lot of evidence around men. We don't ask men a lot of things. So I'd love to see a bit more evidence. Kelly.
So,
Well, with Julia and her team, obviously.
Yeah. More to do. Helena.
picking up on that point, though, I mean, last year we did some work again with Business in the Community on called Equal Lives, which is asking men, not just fathers actually, but men with caring responsibilities, often older relatives or disabled adults and so forth. And actually, it was so. I mean, to be honest, it was really poignant listening to, in this country, women are only 1.5 times more likely to be a carer of another adult than men. And many of these men, the majority, 2/3, had not disclosed to their employer that they had caring responsibilities for fear of either losing their job or because they couldn't be so committed, or let alone career progression. So I think this is the great thing about your research, that it shows that we've got to redress the balance. That the concern that comes out all the time through it is that men feel a bit resentful, a bit unsure about their own futures, a bit like they're carrying the burden. And all three of you have said already that this is the obvious next step from the findings, that actually we need to have much more of a dialogue with men. And as I said earlier, it gives me hope that I think particularly the next generation of men, by which I also include young men who are at work. I have a male colleague at Legal & General who, the day I joined, contacted me to ask if he could help with the gender equality work I was doing. And I asked him why, and he said, well, me and my girlfriend are thinking of getting married, thinking of having a family. I want us to share and all of that, and I don't want to work the way that the 50-year-olds around me are working necessarily, but I love my job. So this is really, really happening, and it's like, you know, when it's snowing, you don't kind of notice at first, and then suddenly it's a blizzard. And so that's also what excites me about the research.
As an Australian, I haven't understood that snowing analogy, but I hope the rest of the room did.
We all accept all that vast army of Australians.
There's a vast army of Australians now confused. No, thank you. So we're going to turn now to audience questions. We've got roving mics, so I'll take a few questions and then come back to the panel. We have about... got one of these watches you can do everything with except tell the time. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so we're going to have to keep it quite interactive, quite short. So we've got a question, George at the back, and then maybe here. So...
Thank you all so much. This has been really interesting. Well, my question is for you, and it's about shared parental leave. My husband took it. He was one of the first people at his very progressive employer to do it. and he hated it. And he hated it for reasons that many of the women in the audience will find really ironic, that it was really hard looking after a 6-month-old. He was really tired all the time. He felt like it was a long time to spend away from work, and he felt it really hard to come back. And he's not really sure if he wants another child, because he knows I would expect him to do it again, and he really doesn't want to. And I find that fascinating, what you're saying about how we support men to do this, how their employers support them, but also how we do that in the home, how we do that culturally. He was really isolated. I think that made it harder. He didn't know who to talk to about it. You've made some points about how politically, how we support men to do that. But I think to the panel at large, what do we do to make to remind men not just about their obligations, but also why it's fun and why it's enjoyable, and how to take pleasure in parenting?
Okay, thank you. What I'm going to get you to do is, if you can hand the mic 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows down and 2 across, this is a group exercise. There we go. And yes, thank you.
Hi, it's great that we've got senior leaders like you. What advice would you give to maybe small fish in big organisations, or people in small organisations? What conversations should we be having with our colleagues now?
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question and then come back to the panel. I'll take a question over here on the edge. Thank you.
I feel I should compare notes with Helena after tomorrow, because I'm talking to an all-girls school as the only male speaker. Have you asked any questions about people's propensity to hire people they perceive to be better than them? Whether any differences between men and women, because the cynic in me would say that the men might do more so to take the credit for the work.
Fascinating, but no.
Okay, so we've got 3 questions there. So the sort of men taking leave, advocating for change in a diversity of organisations, small organisations, from being a junior person, and whether we know anything about hiring practices to take credit. Will, do you want to address the first one?
Yeah, I mean, that's great. That sounds like gender equality. And I guess you have to look at, the equivalent. I mean, I'm not a woman, and I've not been a mother, and I probably never will be. But I think we have a societal relationship with motherhood which is very strong and not necessarily very based in reality. But I think men will see that as well, and when men try and be the mother and take time off, you're going to find it hard, and it is really boring picking up baked beans by hand. This is, but it is also amazing, and I mean, I could start from a very personal. I start from a point of view that we made a decision to have children, and I really like looking after them. But I mean, I think you will have a much more informed conversation about whether to have a second child or not than almost everyone else on the planet, and that is a great thing. So well done.
Would someone like to take the question about smaller organisations, or from a more junior perspective, advocating for change?
So I'm happy to contribute to that.
Yes.
So I guess if you're more junior in an organisation and you want to advocate for gender equality, it can be quite tricky. And one of the things that I think can help is just encouraging transparency in the workplace by asking for it. Asking for transparency about pay bands, asking for transparency about how decisions are being taken about recruitment. And that's something that even small employers or even more senior people in your organisation should want to deliver on, because those are the kind of things that motivate staff.
I think it's also important, because I just add to that, because I agree entirely, but I also think it's really important to get allies or mentors. That I think we have this tendency to think that we have to come up with all the answers ourselves, and that when we don't have the answers ourselves, and often someone can open a door, be a sounding board, doesn't matter how junior you are. I found that lots and lots of people want to help today, so a lot of people, I agree with you, Pamela, about the sisterhood is missing sometimes, but there are also lots of women and men who are very keen to see really talented young people progress. So somehow or other, getting yourself a mentor or an ally who's going to look out for you. Don't try to battle it by yourself, because I think that is quite risky.
Unfortunately, we don't have the data to answer your questions, so a future research project. We've got time to take one round more of questions, so I'll take a question here and then two back, you, and I'll take Jude. Yep, thank you.
Congratulations to the Centre for the hard data here. And I'm interested in the appetite to look at the issue of childcare costs, because things like paternity and job sharing are not available to the vast majority of working families. And we've had a fabulous policy initiative in this country in the last year, which is the gender pay reporting. But the UK remains one of the highest cost countries on the planet when it comes to childcare costs. And there's been next to no government focus on this. And so I would love to suggest it as something that the Centre focus on, obviously not just as a UK issue, but a global issue. And is that something that you could add to your future data survey?
Thank you. And we take the mic 2 rows back.
Thank you all. Really inspirational discussions tonight. My question is, if we look back, and we can celebrate quite a lot has happened, even in my lifetime. I've got a mortgage. My mother wouldn't have been able to have one. I can live on my own, I can travel. So we must celebrate that success. But equally, back to the point about gender fatigue, how do we help more employers to enable more wills so that actually it becomes the norm, and those children behind us grow up idealistic now because they assume it will happen, but actually it does happen, and they don't end up being the role models that we are for them, in that the man does all the work and the woman does most of the childcare.
Jude.
Thanks.
Jude, do you want to stand up? I'm gonna
And be counted.
whilst you've got the mic, do you
Yeah.
want to just do a few sentences on WOW?
Okay. All right. I'm Jude Kelly. I started the WOW Women of the World festivals 9 years ago. Some of you will know of that. This year I left South Bank Centre, where I was the artistic director, to take it on as a full-time charity, because it's now in 20 countries and it's growing so quickly. So I'm optimistic, because travelling all over the world as I do, I see how much the conversation has accelerated. In fact, Bloomberg have been a big supporter of the WOW Festival, I must say that. But one of the things that is interesting, the whole panel have talked about recalibrating identity as the only method by which we can kind of rethink what gender justice would look like. Men have got to feel that their identity is enhanced by gender justice, not diminished by it. But I think I wanted to pick up on what Pamela was really saying, which is that if there are large swathes of the populations of many countries who do want to champion equality, then they are engaged in, well, that means equality on many counts: intersectional equality, race, class, disability, sexual orientation. And that, I think, produces the fatigue in people of who less want equality, because it feels like so many questions have got to be raised, which they do. So, I suppose my question really is, do we feel that we can dig in really deeply on gender justice and say that we're prepared for this to be the long haul of looking at all those intersectional injustices and saying we're going to have that conversation in total? We just can't race to the front so that white women get on the FTSE 100. We got it there, because that just reinforces other injustices. So that's why I think it's a long haul. Are we up for it?
So we've got a range of questions there on childcare costs. I think, Kelly, you...
Sure. So your question was a wee bit about additional research there, gender pay gap reporting, as well as the childcare costs. So the recent World Economic Forum produced a top 10 countries to live in if you're a woman. Top country, Iceland, because for decades they have had really good social policies around low-cost childcare, but high-quality low-cost childcare, coupled with really good parental leave. So they've had this sort of really sweet spot that is starting to pay off in terms of gender equality. We've had gender pay gap reporting now. This is the second year, I believe, we're doing it. I'm looking at the team who actually run it for us, just sitting over there. And I have just asked our team of econometricians to run some analysis for us, pulling out all the data from all firms in the UK with 250 plus employees and those with less. Is it starting to make a difference, and can we track that over time? And I was going to tell you about it and see if you wanted to partake. Because I think this will be interesting, because nobody's looking to see whether it's making a difference in how employers are engaging with this issue. And then on the childcare costs, absolutely, it needs to be looked at as well, but that is another research project for another day.
Could I make a request when you look into that? Because I think one of the issues, because this has been obviously an ongoing issue in this country for a long, long time. Every government of every political persuasion, says, oh, we can't afford it, and what other things would you like to do to help with gender equality? And that's probably the biggest thing that could be done. So if you could do some analysis showing a bit like, when they did the Laffer curve for tax, showing that if you had a 100% tax rate, you get no tax revenues. And if you had a 0% tax rate, you have no tax revenues either. So there's somewhere in between. It's not that childcare costs the country necessarily. If you can show how it would empower women to be a bigger part in the economy, I think we've got to have some compelling research that just shows us this short-term worry that politicians have. And clearly affordability is an issue, but if you could show that you could actually get more economic benefit from it, there would be much less pushback, I think.
The question on getting employers, what can we do? I mean, Pamela, you've addressed this a bit by saying we've got to move beyond just the business case argument in the general to the specific, and hopefully we can even move beyond that to just doing it because it's right. But does anybody else, do you want to add, or does anybody else want to add on what we can do to better push employers for more flexible policies?
One of the things that I think is really interesting to me is that when you see men working flexibly or job sharing, that it's usually sort of quiet and nobody knows about, and it's all secret squirrel. And what organisations aren't doing is showcasing role models that are making it work, that are thriving and that are contributing to the business. And it's one of the things that really bugs me a lot in organisations, is like you have people doing it and doing it really well. And if you can demonstrate that to other parts of your organisation, it encourages others to take a risk on doing it as well. So I think, look for those role models in your organisation, seek them out, make sure that you're promoting them, showing other parts of the organisation how it can be done and how it can be successful, much like your situation. And I think that does help a lot. But, this whole secret squirrel thing about, people work flexibly and don't tell anybody about it is just perpetuating the issue that we have.
Yeah, it was a brilliant study, I think, by Harvard, and it was looking at pretty senior people, but it basically said the best thing you can do to enable flexible working is get a PA, because basically then they can block out your diary, invent fake breakfasts, you can have like
executive time,
you can have client lunches, whatever.
President
I'm in Hong Kong that week, and like, and it was actually how it worked. But the role models, even worse than not being celebrated, are like they're hiding.
No, they're hiding.
They're by diary blocking, which is great for them, but not so good for the wider cause. I think there is.
I like that, the invented week in Hong Kong.
Yeah. I haven't tried that one myself, actually, but I think there is something about not just focusing on. So when you're looking at policies, I think you started talking about carers. Like caring is huge, and it's a real impact on people's daily life. It's a very daily thing. It's a huge source of stress and worry, and I think if you can start including that. And you talk about flexible working as a way to manage your caring responsibilities, or even have a hobby. Like it's at the moment, I guess what I'm saying is we focus it, and I'm as guilty as this anyone, very much on children. But it is about people being whole people, and whatever that is. In my case, it's largely about my small kids, but as they move into school, I'm not planning on going back to work straight away. I'm quite enjoying, having a hobby. But actually, for a lot of people, it is about caring, and I think that bringing that conversation, it opens it out, and it means you're talking less about words like gender inequality, which some men find difficult to associate with, whereas caring, is something that they'll face.
Well, everyone's a human being. I mean, that's the bizarre thing about the working environment that we have created over many, many years. We've created it as if people don't have lives outside work often. And obviously, not just young people wanting this, but we can all see that it doesn't make any sense, particularly when you can work. remotely in many jobs, so you can't necessarily change your air pilot midway through the flight, but you can do a lot of things in a more creative way. And actually it's shown to obviously help people's productivity. There's less carbon footprint. There's what's not to like, except for the fact that we're just not used to it. I just wanted to pick up on Jude's point.
Yes,
if
I was
I
going to
may,
come to...
but maybe everybody gets a chance.
Yeah,
How you
I was
want to
going
do
to
that,
come to
Julia?
Jude's as it's a challenge. Challenge to us, challenge to everybody here. So I was going to come to that as the last fantastic question and ask the group for responses, and then we will have to call it a night. So please.
Well, I think what's something we haven't talked about so far this evening, and it's perhaps an awkward thing to say, but I think in some ways all the emphasis on gender in the last few years has perhaps backfired a little bit. That it looks like we don't care about the other dimensions, and I think it might be partly why we've got the resentment figures throwing your data, but also why we might have the gender fatigue particularly, and men feeling sort of got at and the burden on them and so forth. There's a litany of issues. So I think actually even if we really, really care about the gender equality, in some ways being quite savvy about how we make those arguments and how we rephrase it in a very conscious way about diversity of thought, about bringing, improving our businesses, about fairness for everybody, and making sure, I've noticed recently that particularly people are very interested in socioeconomic diversity and a real awareness that suddenly, partly because entry-level salaries might be really low, they're creating this only private school educated people can apply sort of mentality they didn't mean to. So I think we can push open doors, but we somehow have to let go a little bit of, dare I say it, banging on about gender, however much we care about it.
I guess it's the ever stop talking and show us the demonstration effects of some of these policies that you're trying to put in place, but also some of the impacts that we will see for everybody, for men and women. And I guess it's part of the reason the Global Institute's been established, in that we have gender pay gap reporting, we have shared parental leave, we have unconscious bias training, we have all sorts of things, including trying to diversify boards, but showcasing and demonstrating that those things are working for everybody and not just doing a case study on what works for women in that particular setting, but how this has benefited men and the organisation as a whole. And there's still quite a gap in the evidence base around what works.
A few years ago, I was at, not that long ago actually, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was at an event and it was celebrating progress on gender diversity, and there were a number of award winners in the room. And I was sat in the audience, and a very, very well-known company, which I will shall remain nameless, stood up and said that they had been really focused on gender diversity over the past 5 years, and they showed they had a very big picture of their board, let's say 5 years previously. It was all white men, and they said this was our board 5 years ago, and then they lifted up another board and they said, and this is our board now, and there was a round of applause because the board now had women on it. And I sat there and I thought, yeah, right, okay, that's great, you've got women on there, but there's no woman that looks like me or any ethnic minority women there. And I put my hand up and said, this is great, but you've gone from an all-white board of men to an all-white board of people. And whilst I applaud you for having gender diversity in there, it's not, it doesn't reflect who I am, or, and doesn't create role models for people who look like me coming up behind you. And the lady said, oh, Pamela, you sort of misunderstand us. This was our gender agenda. So I literally looked at her and said, and I'm not a woman? And that, do you know what, I'd always recognised up until that point that I led with my ethnicity before my gender, but I tell you, the penny dropped big time that day for me, because I realised that organisations, when they thought about gender, they had missed a big trick of recognising women in all their diversity. And from that moment, for me, the narrative changed. It wasn't about diversity anymore, it was about inclusion. And inclusion is so important. It is not just about some of us, it's about all of us. And how do we all create equality for everybody? And that's really been the agenda that we have been trying to push at Bloomberg, about all of us, not some of us. And if we continue to push this agenda and it only benefits some of us, we've lost out. In fact, we haven't really moved the agenda forward at all. So It's about inclusion, Jude. You know, that's very important to me, and it's about all of us.